You're listening to Econ to Icon, thoughtful conversations with influential figures from economics and public life, exploring the economic issues they've shaped and the careers they've made. Here are your hosts, Paul Johnson and Michael Kell.
Hello and welcome to Econ to Icon. I'm Paul Johnson and I've spent most of my career working on economics and in particular the economics of public policy at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in government and now at Frontier Economics as well as the Queen's College, Oxford. And I've discovered in all of that economics really does shape everything around us, the policies that affect all of us, taxes, pensions, public services. And in this podcast, we're going to talk to people who have been right at the centre of those decisions.
And I'm Michael Kell. I spent 30 odd years as an economist as well. I've worked at the Treasury, at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, at the National Audit Office. But these days I work as a careers coach. So alongside Paul's focus on the substance of economics and policy, I'm interested in the person, how careers unfold, the turning points that people face, and what it's actually like to sit in the room when big decisions are being made.
So whether you're interested in economics, public policy, or simply how people build and adapt long careers,
we hope you'll find something interesting and useful in this podcast.
In this, our first episode, we're going to talk to Sir Steve Webb. He's actually someone that Mike and I first knew when we all started our careers together a long time ago at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. He went on to a remarkable career spanning academia, politics, and the private sector.
And Steve's career is a particularly rich one from the point of view of what this podcast is about. So he started life as an economist and then moved into politics, first as an MP and ending up as pensions minister during the coalition government of 2010 to 2015, where Steve helped drive through major reforms to the UK state pension scheme.
So we're going to explore with him how those reforms actually happened, what it takes to get a major policy change through government, how you work with or around institutions like the Treasury, what economics and his economics training contributed when he was trying to make real-world decisions under pressure.
And we also look at the personal side. Steve talks very openly about the transitions in his career from academia into politics, and then the much more abrupt transition out of politics when he lost his seat. Steve describes losing not just a job, but an identity, and having to rebuild from there.
So this is a conversation about economics in practice, and about how ideas become policy.
And it's about a career that's full of risk, reinvention, and some very human trade-offs.
Steve, rather than me trying to tell everyone about what you've done through your career, perhaps you could just summarise some of the highlights and how you moved from economics nerd to pensions minister to a partner in a big actuarial firm.
Thanks very much, Paul. Mike, nice to see you all. Nice to catch up. I hope that listeners won't be bored by all the reminiscing, but I do recall joining the IFS straight from university in the mid-1980s, and then essentially it was more or less mandatory to have an Oxford PPE degree, as I recall. I think things have got more diverse since then, but it did have that slight feel at the time. So Mike and I joined at the time. A couple of years later, you joined. We always knew you were destined for great things, but hopefully we can swap seats on this podcast and you can be the icon, because I'm slightly startled by that adjective. Anyway, to answer your question, because now I'm not a politician, I suppose I have to answer people's questions, don't I? I guess there's three phases to my career. There's a kind of academic phase. So 9 years, I still sometimes think my favourite job, to be honest, at the Institute for Fiscal Studies as a microeconomist looking at taxes and benefits and poverty and things like that. A couple of transitional years as Professor of Social Policy at Bath University once my political career was getting going. And then 18 years at Westminster, mostly as an opposition Lib Dem MP for the seat where I live still in the west of England. The final 5 of those as pensions minister in the coalition government. And then in 2015, the electorate invited me to take what's known in the trade as a midlife career review. So at the age of 49 3/4, I was unemployed. And soon after, I started working for a mutual insurer called Royal London. And so it was nice to have implemented automatic enrolment into workplace pensions and then work for a firm that was actually doing it on the ground and seeing how it worked and so on. And after 4 or 5 years there, I moved to my current role, which is a partner with a firm of actuaries called Lane, Clark and Peacock, which is a partnership. So I'm one of the partners there. Nicely, neatly divided up into 3 chunks for you.
So, Steve, can I take you back and ask how you got interested in economics?
Yes, it did very much start at school. So bit of an outlier at school. There weren't many kids quite like me. And I loved sort of numbers and analysis, and I certainly got that off my dad. We were writing a eulogy for my dad recently and reflecting on the fact that when your dad comes home and he gets his slide rule out and shows you how that works, and once brought home a mechanical calculating machine for me to play with. And so I learned not to be afraid of numbers. The numbers were always my friend kind of thing. And again, my dad was interested in business and he liked to pick stocks and shares and stuff like that. So that was always, it was in the water almost. And so at school, I did economics and maths and that kind of stuff. And it was also linked to current affairs, and I was interested in current affairs. So it was an obvious progression, really. And so most of the degrees I applied for were straight economics with a bit, funny enough, with a bit of actuarial science, because I like the math side of things. And PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics was the only sort of mixed degree I applied for.
So why PPE then?
It was that mix, I think, of the economics that I knew, but in broader context. And it's funny, it's a bit of a joke, really, that you do PPE, so you end up with half an economics degree. And I certainly remember people at IFS then going and doing a proper economics degree afterwards to top up. I never quite got around to doing that, so I'm half an econ to an icon. But I think, as it turns out, it was a good course because it gave you context. I think economics these days is very technical. And sometimes understanding the philosophical underpinnings and just the world of political economy, it's a bit old-fashioned, but actually sometimes I think that's quite easy to lose because you can always do the technical stuff later, but you can never really come back to get the context, I think.
Yeah, I think Mike and I would have to agree with that, as we did the same thing. But it's very true, and I find that with younger people still, that those who've had a bit of a broader background in economics rather than just the technical stuff really grasp the context that we're working. Look, actually, Steve, you said you were a bit of an outlier at school, which I suspect I also felt, and maybe Mike did too. Could you tell us what you meant by that? Were you the only one who was really quite as bright and nerdy and focused as you were?
I was trying to be tactful, I suppose. So I went to a large comprehensive school, which I'm a big fan of comprehensive education, but I benefited from the fact that the teachers saw potential in me and pushed me further. I still remember in my final year at primary school, the head teacher gave me kind of one-on-one lessons in what would be called O-level algebra. So they gave me a textbook and I took it away and did some of the puzzles as I saw them. At secondary school, I had a head of sixth form who wanted people to go to Oxbridge and would take a few of us on a trip. And I suppose you could say that was elitist and so on, but I was privileged that they pushed me. So I think at one point I was thinking of applying to do business French at Wolverhampton Polytechnic because I was quite good at French. And they just pushed me to stretch myself. So I benefited from that, really.
So, Steve, how was it going from a comprehensive in the Midlands to Oxford?
I had the advantage that the way I got into Oxford, as it were, was they had a scheme for bright kids from middling schools, for kids who wouldn't perhaps have even applied necessarily. And you did it on interview. So I went up to Hertford College, which is where I ended up going, and they was middling college in the league tables, and they saw a potential to boost their performance by getting bright kids who wouldn't otherwise have applied. So I went, did some interviews, did well in them, and got a 2Es offer to get into Oxford. So many of my sixth form colleagues were a bit narked at this, that they were being asked for 2As and a B, and I was being asked for 2Es. So I still did the entrance exam, but only as a sort of benchmarking thing. So it meant that the college I was going to was more diverse as a result, is where I'm getting to with this. So there were, call it Christchurch or somewhere where everyone had been to Eton and Harrow and stuff like that. I wouldn't have fitted in so well, but it was a more normal experience.
And something tells me, Steve, even though you had a 2Es offer, you didn't slack off, did you? I bet you didn't get 2Es, did you?
I cleared that hurdle with some margin.
Yeah, you did all right. Yeah. I thought so.
And so just something else to throw into the mix, and we may talk about this later, is at university, I hadn't been a churchgoer until I went to university, and I was invited by people from college to go to a church in the city and became a Christian, started going regularly. And that gave me a community. Because obviously when you're at university, everyone you know is 19, 20 or 21-ish. And suddenly you become part of a community where so I play the oboe as an instrument, and I started playing the oboe in the church and became part of a music group where there were people who were 20 or 30 years older or were grandparents, and that just meant I had a family beyond college, and that kind of gave me a life beyond. And many of my friends since then are people I met that way rather than people I studied.
So that's interesting, Steve. Obviously I knew that you're a person of faith, and you have been certainly from when I met you when you were 21. But I guess I always assumed it was from your kind of family background, but it sounds as if it wasn't. It came after that.
That's right. And again, I remember when I started at IFS and a few people were struggling a bit. They'd moved to London, didn't really know anybody. And I moved to London and immediately joined a local church and immediately had family. And that sort of people who were just not exactly like me, and some diversity and some security. And so I think that's been a source of stability in life alongside all the other things that have gone on.
And I guess that's one of the things that many people miss. You get that possibly also through joining a political party, which you did later on, but some people do that, or joining other sorts of groups to go alongside work. And I think people who miss that probably do miss out on something. But as you said, when moving to IFS, I found moving to, in some ways, Steve, I think you and I had slightly similar backgrounds in coming from big comprehensives, pretty unusual to go to Oxford. Were pretty successful at Oxford, found it a sort of slightly odd place, but did okay. But then I personally found coming to the IFS really quite hard because actually, frankly, I felt a bit dim with people like you and Mike.
We coped, Paul, it's all right.
Which I honestly hadn't felt previously. How did you find the transition from undergraduate work to coming and working at IFS?
In one sense, it was such a perfect fit for me. I remember getting to the final year of university, and there was a joke that the Oxford University Careers Service had a computer, and it would ask you 10 questions, and then it would recommend you became a management consultant. And I didn't know what I wanted to do. I remember going through, there was a paper back in the day, a thick careers guide thing for what different jobs, and I went through the index from A to Z, and I couldn't find anything I wanted to do. And it was only actually when I saw an actual job advert for the IFS, and I read that, and it's microeconomist and this and that. And I thought, oh, that's a bit of me. And at the time I was working, my tutor, George Yarrow, was one of the pioneers on industrial economics and privatisation. So I actually joined the IFS when John Kay was there, thinking I was going to be working in business economics and all that sort of stuff. And I arrived to be told that they were leaving Nick Morris were leaving in 4 weeks' time or something, and I'd be working on tax and benefits. And as it happens, that's turned out to be not a bad trajectory. But had John Kay stayed, I might have been head of Ofgem or something by now. I don't know. But on your other question, yeah, I mean, absolutely. You come to the IFS and there are some staggeringly clever people. And I just accepted that. And I think over my life, it's a funny thing. When I was pensions minister, I always used to say in every meeting I'd have in the department, there was always somebody in the room who knew more about the subject than I did. Because they were the super specialists and you were drawing on the specialists. So I've long been of the view that you play to your strengths, that actually I was quite happy to talk to the journalists and explain things slowly and in words of one syllable and all that sort of stuff. Whereas someone who's really clever might have struggled a bit more with that. So I just thought I'll do what I'm good at and be pleased that other people are better than I am at what they do.
My abiding memory of you, Steve, at the IFS is you just loved, or my perception was you loved doing the programming. And I remember when you got the program to compile, there you go, everyone remember that word? You would light up.
I am a Renaissance man, really. But
No, but it's a serious point because
yeah.
I think looking at how your career has played out, I think it makes you an unusual person, in my experience, to have that breadth of coding right through to running an MP's surgery on every day.
I guess not being afraid of data has been useful throughout. So although I don't sit and write computer code in quite the same way as I used to, being able to see a document or a table of figures and spot a trend or spot something that doesn't look right and so on has been immensely useful in all sorts of settings, really. IFS was just staggeringly good training in all sorts of ways. One of them being public speaking, because people say to me today, if I do a good talk at an event, going, how did you get, honestly, I've been doing this for 40 years. You do realise that you arrive at IFS and within weeks you're standing up in front of an audience of people explaining stuff. So it's a fantastic training ground, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it was always, I think you were doing incredibly well at the IFS. You were a great academic. You were a great researcher. And then you decided to go into politics. So how did that happen?
It was a conversation, I think, that clinched it with our friend and colleague Andrew Dilnott. And I just, so that I don't forget to say this, I think I've been blessed with some tremendous role models in my different jobs. And Andrew was the first. I think that we all love Andrew, who is a lovely human being.
Andrew was the director of IFS in the through most of the 1990s.
Indeed, but when I joined, simply my line manager kind of thing. So not at that point as illustrious as he became. But I remember talking to him and we'd done some analysis on some options for child benefit. And I said, we've set out the options, Andrew, but what do we think? And I just said, we don't think anything. And it would be slightly facetious, but that sense of IFS does the analysis, puts it out there, and other people make choices. And during the 80s, I was researching poverty trends. We did a lot of detailed work on poverty statistics and all of that. And it was under Mrs. Thatcher, and you remember the 1988 budget when Nigel Lawson slashed income tax for high earners, round about the time they were taking away grants for fridges from single moms on benefit kind of thing, and they had to have repayable loans. I started to get quite cross. So I'd have my kind of IFS, it's not quite Clark Kent and Superman, but I'd have my mild-mannered analytical IFS, and then I'd go home and be quite cross and angry and wanting to change things. And I think the big turning point was the 1992 general election. So at that point, the Conservatives had been in for 13 years. Everybody assumed that was the end and there would be change, and they won again. And I remember that moment during the 92 election night when a Conservative candidate's beaming smile came from a seat that they were expected to lose, and they won. And I just thought, I can't do this anymore. So I joined the Lib Dems immediately after the 92 election. Initially got involved in national sort of policy making behind the scenes, and then finally decided to take the plunge and stand. So I did that in 95, got selected for a seat, and then had to leave the IFS because IFS obviously non-party political, but you are allowed to corrupt the nation's youth in higher education. So I was able to take up a chair at Bath University for a couple of years. And when I arrived, I said to them, look, don't worry, I'm standing for Parliament in a couple of years' time, but I won't win, because I was standing for a seat that included the badminton horse trials, the Beaufort Hunt and Chipping Sodbury. This wasn't obvious hunting ground for the Lib Dems, but the 97 tide washed me ashore, as it were.
The Lib Dems is not the obvious place. You ended up in government, but it's not the obvious place to go when you want to change the world, in the sense that, however optimistic Lib Dems might be, they certainly at that stage there was no realistic possibility of them forming a government. So in that sense, you were pretty much as unlikely, as I say, it turned out differently, but the likelihood of changing the world from the Liberal Democrats at that point must have looked pretty remote.
Yeah, fair point, actually. Perhaps it was a slip, I don't know. I knew what I wasn't. I knew I wasn't a Conservative, and had the circumstances been different, maybe it would have been Labour. But one of the funny things, again, about the Lib Dems is, as a smaller party, they relied more on external resource like think tanks. So I got to know a young researcher called Ed Davey, a researcher called David Laws, both of whom went on to be ministers, Ed's leader of the party, and so on. So I met people, I liked the people, and I think people is crucial. If you meet people whose values you share, or you think you can work with, and frankly, that's been true of my professional career as well. It's the people you work with fundamentally. And yeah, you're a Lib Dem, you don't think you're necessarily even going to get elected to Parliament. Ming Campbell, esteemed Lib Dem elder statesman, stood 5 times before he got elected. I had no particular reason to think I'd get in. If I got in, I'd no particular reason to think I'd get in again. So that's why, in a way, I can be so positive, because it was all gain. It was all upside. It was all better than I could have dreamt. Being an MP for 18 years, as it turned out, getting to be a pensions minister is just what's not to like, really.
But Steve, take us back to that transition. So you get elected, maybe somewhat to your surprise. And then what's it like starting as an MP?
It is a huge transition. First of all, I'd had the transition a couple of years earlier of leaving the IFS but not having a job to go to. So that was a big leap into the unknown. I had to give in my notice basically as soon as I was selected. I didn't know what I was going to do next. So that was a big transition. So landing the job at Bath and everything that led up to that was quite significant. But yeah, being elected, it's like running a small business, having never run a small business. So you have to rent premises, you have to recruit staff, you have to plan how to split your time between Westminster and the constituency. You have lots of expectations you'll be visible in the constituency, but also you want to be visible and impactful in Westminster. And you're just torn. And, how certain MPs do other jobs as well is beyond me. I became a minister and did another job as well. But you really see it as a full-time job and some. And the other big change is it becomes your identity. It really isn't just a job. You become, particularly in an area like mine, if you are an MP for a big city and there are 8 MPs for Manchester and you're just the MP for Manchester North West Central or something, that's different. But when you're the MP for an area of towns and villages, you are a kind of minor local celebrity. The local paper wants to report where you're going on holiday so people can tut disapprovingly for spending too much money, or you go into the shops and your children are, the MP's children. So that's quite a change. And then, of course, rolling ahead, spoiler alert, when you lose all of that. You lose who you were. Didn't you used to be Steve Webb? I think someone said to me once. So it is a huge transition. And there is a bit of help because there are other MPs doing the same transition and there's training and you talk to each other. But particularly with the Lib Dems, it really is like herding cats. Lib Dems temperamentally are individualists. They don't believe in coercion and the state. They believe in people flourishing by doing their own thing to some extent. And so everybody did it their own way.
But it must also have been a big impact, I assume, on your life in the sense of your impact on your wife. And you've already talked about it affects your kids. So tell us a bit about that aspect of the transition. Suddenly your wife had to change her job too or her identity in some sense.
Yeah, it's a big change for the family. So our eldest was born just before I was elected, our youngest shortly afterwards. So we have two children, and that's all they ever knew. Again, and then when I lost in 2015 and they were mid-teenagers, that was the first count we ever let them come along to see Dad lose his job at 4 o'clock in the morning in a leisure centre. But yeah, it does affect them, and I think they've probably never really fully told me quite how much. And fortunately, Helen, my wife's been very supportive and enabled me to do all of this. But yeah, you are away. You're typically away 3 nights a week, 40 weeks a year. But then your time isn't your own when you're around. If you got to open a school fete on a Saturday afternoon, you can't say, it's the weekend, I'll be back at work on Monday or anything like that. So it does take over. And I think Lib Dems have to be super active because back in the day, I used to talk to sixth formers and say how unfair the voting system was. Because if you're a Labour MP for the middle of Glasgow or a Tory MP for Kent or a Lib Dem for the south tip of Cornwall, you've probably got a job for life. You wouldn't say that now. But back in the day, some people essentially inherited a seat from their party that they were going to win anyway, never really had to do anything much, and they were going to win. That's just not the case when you're from a smaller party in a sort of fairly marginal seat. So you're hyperactive anyway.
So in 2010, I assume, contrary to your sort of expectations, the Lib Dems went into coalition and you were made a pensions minister. I'm just fascinated by the sort of once it looked like there was a coalition, you'd been pension spokesman in opposition, hadn't you? Is that right? Yeah. So did you expect to become the pensions minister then? Were you hooping it? Were you sat by your phone for days waiting for someone to give you a call?
It was all a bit of a shock. So the 2010 election happened, nobody won. And for the first 5 or 6 days, it was, is there going to be a minority government? Is there going to be a coalition with the Lib Dems and Tories? Could even we keep Gordon Brown in and all of that? And the focus, others perhaps were more focused on their ministerial jobs, but I was very immersed in just are we going to be part of this? We'd spent all my election campaign saying, don't vote for me if you don't want a Conservative. And then suddenly, we're talking about coalition. So all of that was going on. Once that had been decided, it was then inevitably you think, I'd love to be a minister. And my one windfall was that only 2 Conservative MPs lost their jobs in 2010 in the election, and one was the pension spokesman, Nigel Waterson. So there was a pensions-shaped hole in DWP that I could take without any Conservative being particularly resentful or any Conservative in Parliament being particularly resentful. So I dropped some hints to the Whip's office saying, looking for a pensions minister, Now, Nick, I wouldn't say I was Nick Clegg's ideological soulmate. I believe, apparently, he told me, I said, did David Cameron actually know who I was? And he said, oh, yes, Steve. He said, Cameron said, will he be sound? And apparently Nick's reply was, no, but he'll be good. And I think Nick's view was that a diversity, he's got to keep them all sort of centre-left of the party happy as well as the centre-right and so on. But it was amazing. Yes, I metaphorically sat by my phone, had a call from Nick. Would I like to be pensions minister? I paused for a few moments to reflect before biting his hand off.
You've made it clear that you're not on the sort of more conservative end of the Lib Dems. Did you have any what was your sense of the politics of, first of all, Lib Dems going into such a close coalition with the Conservatives, but also your boss was Iain Duncan Smith as the Secretary of State, who is a pretty conservative guy for Conservative.
Yeah, on the big picture, I think you deal with the cards you've been dealt. None of us would have started with there. None of us wanted to be in coalition with the Conservatives. But what were the options? And that's been well rehearsed. So I think I just took it as given. That's what the electorate had given us to do. It's easy to forget that the financial markets were still pretty rough at that point. We weren't long after the global financial crash. People were saying to us, if you don't have a coalition by the end of Sunday, markets will crash on Monday morning, the pound will fall. There was a lot of sense of actually having a stable government for 5 years was a win and good for the nation. And David Cameron's famous phrase of 2010, I want to make a big, bold offer to the Liberal Democrats. And that there were things I've been involved in Lib Dem policy making for 20 odd years, which is the ultimate futility. given what you've said, finer details of land value taxation and stuff like that. You never thought any of this stuff would happen, and suddenly you got a chance to do some of what you believed in. Why wouldn't you? So that's how it happened. The relationship I built up with Iain was a good one. We were, as you can imagine, ideologically very different, temperamentally very different, but we managed to build up a mutual respect. And actually the big driving for, because I respected the fact that Iain Duncan Smith, having lost to Tory leadership, could have just gone off and been a director on lots of boards and been a member of the House of Lords and had a very comfortable lifestyle. And he didn't do that. He set up a social justice think tank, produced reports, models for the welfare state, and he wanted to implement universal credit, which was merging lots of different benefits in one to make work pay. So a lot of that I was pretty comfortable with. So yes, George Osborne was saying, oh, can you save 5 billion quid off the benefits bill, which was pretty uncomfortable. But whoever had been there, we would have to do that. So actually, I respected Iain, what he was trying to achieve. He realised that I was willing to be part of the team, and he then supported me in the pension stuff and wasn't particularly interested in pensions. So I had an extraordinarily privileged ability to largely drive that agenda for 5 years.
And as pensions minister, you really did drive an agenda. And again, I think it's not just us saying so, you're generally seen as having been one of the most successful pensions minister in a very long time, because you actually managed to make some changes, partly driving through what was the previous government's policy on auto-enrolment, which is this system whereby people are effectively automatically enrolled into a pension and have to make a bit of an effort not to be. But I think it's fair to say that the thing that will stand out from your time there is the introduction of something called the flat rate state pension, or the new state pension, where you, I think, pretty much personally drove through what's a pretty radical change in the structure of the state pension. It might be worth just very briefly giving listeners a sense of what that was. But I then want to ask you about how you did that, because that was not a straightforward thing to achieve.
Yeah, so the reform was to take a very complicated multi-level system of state pensions and roll it up into a single flat rate payment. So prior to that, you'd have a basic pension, and many women got very poor basic pensions. You'd have an earnings-related bit on top, but some people didn't have that because they had a company pension, and nobody really knew how much they were going to get, and it's incredibly difficult to plan, and lots of pensioners were still below the poverty line, didn't claim top-ups. So we wanted a simpler system that would be a foundation for the private pension changes that you mentioned, Paul, and would be fairer to women. Those were some of the driving features of the reform. And the Treasury said to us, so just on your question of how we landed it. So one thing I did, which was regarded as a bit edgy, was I asked the Chancellor's political special advisor, a chap called Rupert Harrison, another ex-IFS person, if we could just talk it through, IFS geek to IFS geek, as it were. And he came over to our department, which was quite unusual, the Chancellor's special advisor coming, and I just walked him through it. And I said, look, let's discuss it. Ask me any questions you want to. This is what we want to achieve. And it just helped him to see what we were trying to do, why we were trying to do it, ask any questions. And we got the word back in due course that the institutional Treasury was not opposed. And it's always the Treasury that block things. So the fact that the Treasury weren't fundamentally opposed to what we were doing was a win. The one condition, they said, is you can't spend any money. Now, Paul, from IFS modelling, that in 30, 40 years' time, this new system's a lot cheaper than the old one, so it actually has very significant long-term savings. But they said in no year at all, at any point, can you spend any money, period. Now, when you bring a new system in where there are gainers, and you have to have transitional protection for losers, it's very hard to square that circle. So it ended up being a messier and more complex transition than it needed to be, because they wouldn't let us spend any money at all. In fact, we created a windfall because of various national insurance changes that were consequent on what we did. But so we had to be ingenious. We had to tweak the corners of the system that I'm still not going to confess that we tweaked to save a bit of money. But I was so pleased. And what was very funny was we were talking about doing it in the second half of the decade. And in the end, the Treasury said, please, can you hurry up? Please, can you do it as quickly as possible? So I was in front of a select committee once defending whether we'd get it done by 2017, knowing I'd already been told to do it by 2016.
Was this something that you, the moment you became pensions minister, this was what you knew you wanted to drive through? I mean, one thing that lots of ministers, ex-ministers say is that you can only get things done if you know what you want to do. Yeah. And I guess if you go into, lots of ministers go into roles they've not been involved with before, they actually just don't know what they want. Not a criticism of them, because there's no reason why they would. So I presume it makes a big difference knowing what you want, actually knowing what you want to achieve.
Yes, one big difference is a change of government. Coming in as change of government. If you're the 7th Labour pensions minister in 8 years or something, it's really hard. You've got a whole lot of legacy stuff to carry through, and you don't get the chance to start from scratch. So a change of government is a good chance to do new stuff. And literally, I said early on, so what do I do? I'm a minister, but what do I actually do? And we had a meeting where they gave me a list of 20 things I could do. And one of them was state pension reform. And I said, a bit like you drag and drop on Amazon, I dragged a bit of state pension reform into my basket, checked out. And in opposition, I'd done a lot on women's state pensions and all of that. So I cared about the issue. I knew about the issue. And the chance to actually reshape it was fantastic, really. I remember Polly Mackenzie, one of Nick Clegg's advisors, saying, Steve, the amount of political capital we had to give to get your pension thing through, because it wasn't in our manifesto, it wasn't in the coalition agreement. So it became, okay, Steve can have his pension if the Tories can have the firstborn or whatever it was.
I remember talking to some of the senior civil servants in the department at the time, and they were a little bit sceptical, I think it would be fair to say, of the capacity to push this through. There was a little bit of a sense of, oh, that Steve Webb, he's a bit naive, he thinks he can get this stuff past the Treasury, he hasn't got a chance, obviously we'll do what he tells us. Did you get a sense of institutional scepticism? How hard did you have to, you described you had a chat with Rupert Harrison and it all went fine, you must have had to work pretty hard to drive this through.
Yeah, and I'm sure my civil servants worked hard with Treasury civil servants, and there's a lot that they do that you don't see. I think the coalition dynamic helped. This became a Lib Dem ask. And so there were things the Conservatives wanted to do, and there's a bit of force trading, and I think that probably helped as well. And it puzzled our civil servants, because Danny Alexander was the Lib Dem at the Treasury. He was the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. And when you've been candidates together and campaigners together, you've got each other on speed dial. So occasionally I could just ring up the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. Whereas if it had been a normal government, it would be like you go through the civil service and the private offices and you arrange 30 minutes in 3 weeks' time. So it was a bit more informal, which probably helped.
Steve, I'm curious about the other aspects of being a minister. So you've talked a bit about the significant policy change that you drove through. What about the rest of it? What was really challenging about all the other stuff that goes with being a minister?
Most of it is just an amazing privilege. One or two of my colleagues who became ministers were moaning all the time, and all the people who didn't get to become ministers said, just think, you could have been actually just on the backbenches having to vote for stuff you're not very keen on without all of the privilege and opportunity. So it's hugely positive. The biggest challenge actually was, I mentioned being a hyperactive local Lib Dem MP. So what would we do? You would stand up in the House of Commons at Prime Minister's questions and demand Tony Blair or Gordon Brown open a local hospital or something in your constituency or whatever it was. Suddenly you're in government, you can't do any of that. So they don't see you anymore, your electors, standing up, campaigning. They don't see you around quite so much because you're just so busy. They think you're terribly important. And you just lose that, and you felt that. I would then go knocking on doors we don't see so much of you now, Steve. Oh, you're in the government now. You've got your nice ministerial car. And that's difficult. And I was just the pensions minister. How prime ministers, chancellors do this. They largely sit in safe seats that they don't have to worry too much. But so that I always felt I had so many different jobs that by the time I finished, it was just a relief to just get some time back, really.
But you've already also said that what a kind of shock it was, the way in which you had to transition from being an MP and a minister into something else. So tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so it was pretty obvious that I wasn't going to be a minister anymore after 2015. I think the coalition had run its course. I thought, although the Lib Dems are going to do badly, you always convince yourself that it's different where you are, that you're the local champion and people like you and so on. So I thought I would probably scrape in. I remember it being 10 o'clock on polling night, and the exit poll, I think, said that the Lib Dems were going to be reduced from 50-ish to 10. And even then, I thought, I'll be one of the 10. And I mentioned that our kids had been too young to go to any election counts in the middle of the night, and we thought, we'll take them this time and they can see Dad win and all the rest of it. And the count was ludicrously slow, and it really was about 5 o'clock in the morning, and the cameras had come from some other constituency to ours because they thought there might be something worth filming. So you are literally in a leisure centre with your family in front of hordes of people and TV cameras being made redundant from your 2 jobs at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's not great HR, I can tell you that. And I remember I went to a primary school the day before the election, and they said, what happens if you lose? And I said, I'll be at Yate Job Centre on Monday morning. And they were like, what? And of course, you're not destitute. They give you 6 months' pay or whatever it is. You have a cushion, which many people don't get when they're made redundant. But you've lost your identity, you've lost your role. I was 49 3/4 at the time. So I had to decide what to do. And I had a windfall, which was that Baroness Ros Altman, who was my successor as pensions minister, made a living on the pension circuit doing conferences and speeches and all the rest of it that she couldn't do. And so there were all these engagements she couldn't fulfill. And she said, I know a man who's got some time on his hands. And so I was able to fulfill these and be suitably rewarded for doing so. And that just got me out there, got me networking. And as I say, you're dealing with a kind of bereavement. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You've lost your identity, you've lost your security and all of that. And I mentioned that where the faith perspective comes into all of this, you are simply trusting and praying, not for a word from the sky, but just thinking, okay, I've had an amazing time so far. There's something else good planned. And a month or so later, I was at a pension conference chatting to someone and said the sort of thing I was looking for. And he mentioned 4 companies who might be looking for that kind of thing. And one was Royal London. And I got involved with a headhunter who contacted Royal London for me, went in to see Phil Loney, the CEO, who's another one of these kind of great role models I've had. And he said, yeah, I think we can do business here. And 6 or 7 months later, I was with Royal London.
What do you say to people who...
I know what you're going to say.
Who say this is this kind of revolving door between the minister sort of gets to know everyone, is making policy, and then they're off into the private sector. Now, I have to say, I don't have a lot of sympathy with that view because, as you say, you're 49 3/4, you needed a job, you weren't a wealthy man, and you had expertise in pensions, so it's obvious that's where you go. But presumably you've been challenged about this, and certainly lots of other former ministers are challenged about it, and occasionally you do look at someone doing it and think, well, that looks a bit iffy. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's a legitimate challenge, and one has to wrestle with that. So there are rules that aren't enforced. So you're not meant to lobby for 2 years. So but lobbying isn't defined. I wrote to the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, ACOBA, saying what I was trying to do. They asked me to delay the start time at Royal London by a couple of months. I think that's largely symbolic, because if I was going to be corrupt, I'd just be corrupt 2 months later kind of thing. But I suppose if your only selling point is your contacts book, then that's pretty if literally you were just plonked into a job, you had no particular background, no particular specialism, but you just happen to know where the bodies are buried and who the people are to ring and what's going on. That's a bit borderline. I hope if you bring some substance, then on balance, because what else? I could have got a general job, but I wouldn't have contributed as much, I don't think, if I had really. I've certainly, as you have, looked at some and thought that doesn't look quite right.
Absolutely. You've managed to stay in the public eye to some extent in your role recently. Then you've moved from Royal London, you say, to LCP. But I think the thing you're probably best known for, post-ministerial role, is this sort of uncovering of underpayments to large numbers of pensioners.
Yeah, fairly soon after I started at Royal London, I started doing a weekly column for This Is Money, which is the Daily Mail's sort of money website. And people write in with their pension questions, and I try and answer them. I enjoy that. And what you don't see is we try and help a few people privately, never end up as newspaper column articles and so on. But one week I wrote a column, someone had written in because his wife's state pension seemed very low, and they'd queried it and it got increased, and we ran the story. And then half a dozen people wrote in the next week and said, that looks a bit like me. So we ran another story, and each time the department said, oh, that's just a set of isolated errors, nothing to see here. So in the end, I resorted to tabling a freedom of information request of my old department, got some figures on how much pensions people were getting, compared that with what I thought they should be getting, and thought, this doesn't look right to me. So we published a report, it's about 2020, and eventually a few months later, the government admitted there was a systemic problem with largely women who had retired, and then something changed post-retirement, which should have triggered a reassessment of their pension, which never happened. So the obvious example is the husband died. So they become a widow, their pension should have been reassessed, it didn't happen. Or the husband retired, pension should have been reassessed, didn't happen. Or they turned 80, pension should have been reassessed, didn't happen. And not lots of people got it right, but too many people were getting it wrong. So the government's ultimately spent about 4 years manually checking over 800,000 individual records, and has paid out about 850 million quid to over 100,000 people who've been underpaid. And the amusing PS to that is they then asked themselves, why weren't we spotting these errors as we went? Maybe we ought to do some proper checks. And then found another £1 billion worth of underpayments from a different error to do with credits for being at home with children, which is an issue I'd first raised 15 years ago in Parliament. So and occasionally you hear from the people who you've helped. So I remember one family we helped, and sadly the lady had died before she knew we'd actually been able to get the money for her. And her family were very grateful, and they said, now we can afford a nice headstone for mum. I talk about billions and millions and all of that, and you just think about the individual families, and that's just really rewarding.
Steve, in your private sector roles, so you've obviously been able to take the opportunity to have some impact, in a sense, outside of what your day job is. But I'm curious also about the day job. Presumably there's a kind of commercial aspect to what you do now. How has that been? Has that been a difficult mindset shift for you?
I think I play to my strengths. So there are people who are much natural salespeople than I am. So we have colleagues who will, if I've done a talk and created a positive impression of the firm and the firm's expertise, will be the people who will seal the deal. And in a way, it's not what people want from me, don't think. If you're in the pension, you're a pension trustee, you're being sold to all the time. So actually, if someone just comes along and says, look, I'm just going to tell you my understanding of what's going on, my analysis, my latest research and thinking, I'm happy to answer your questions. I've looked at your pension scheme and I can see you've got these issues. They really value that. And then that creates a warmer territory for others to sell, if you like. So I don't have to do too much of that. The other thing I just incredibly good fit. The role is, if I sat down and described the kind of job I'd want, it's the one I've got. And I get the freedom to write, to research, to do this horrible phrase, thought leadership. So much gets called thought leadership and nobody's thoughts have ever been led by it. Actually, to use data, to tap into the brilliant people I work with, because I have a thirst for learning. Working for Royal London, I learned a huge amount. Working for LCP, I've learned a huge amount. It would be shocking if people knew how little I knew about pensions at the point I ceased being the pensions minister. Because I've just gone on learning. So as long as I do, that's great, really.
I think that's a request to become pensions minister again, and you'd be
well, you know,
even better this time around.
If the call comes.
We should probably start to wrap this up a bit. You've obviously had, as you said at the beginning, three phases, your sort of career as an economist in research, as a politician and a minister, and now working on pensions in quite an analytical and research-focused capacity. The title of this podcast is From Econ to Icon. I mean, to what extent is economics, or has it been important to you or not, since you actually left IFS and started on a different kind of career? Do you feel that you're shaped by studying economics, practicing it, or is that sort of just in the past?
Yeah, very much. I think it is. Microeconomics in particular is a way of thinking. And so the classic example I would give is in government and in Parliament. The typical person who comes to you says, X is good, therefore we should subsidise X. And the Treasury get this all the time. It might be, I don't know, solar panels or wind farms, or whatever it happens to be. And you always immediately, as the microeconomist, say, well, I agree that X is good, but are we getting the right amount of X anyway? And if we subsidise it with people who are going to do it, would there be a dead weight? And all that? And you just immediately go into that kind of way of thinking about things. Unfortunately, it's to some extent the way the Treasury thinks. So you can, if you're talking to the Treasury, you understand already what they're going to say and the way they think. So that helps. So I think when I used to teach social policy at Bath, a lot of it, it wasn't an economics course, it was a social policy course. But I made absolutely sure we had a module or a big session on market failure, because I think it's the single biggest concept that people need to understand, and it applies in so many areas of public policy. So I think I suppose I'm a welfare economist of sorts, so I care about distributions and not just efficiency, but I do think thinking about efficiency is important.
Yeah, and you and I worked very much on distributions. We worked together all those years ago. All music to our ears as economists. And thinking about one of the things we hope that we're having, one of the sort of groups of people we hope are going to listen to this are maybe younger people studying economics or thinking about studying economics or setting out on their careers. Any thought or advice for anyone who might be listening who's thinking about starting their career in economics?
I think it's just such a transferable discipline, isn't it? There are so many avenues where an economic skill is directly relevant as a main occupation or as a subsidiary skill. Anyone interested in public policy, I think a grounding in economics is essential. And I was just thinking, as you said that, Paul, we just think about tariffs, which seem to be strangely topical. Huge questions about, is President Trump right? And you just put a tariff on and that gives you extra revenue and everyone moves into home production and it's a win-win? Or is there anything else going on, perhaps? And a kind of calm economic assessment of all that stuff is invaluable, really. So I just think it evolves as a discipline. My one sadness about economics, really, and fortunately I'm sufficiently distant, is that it's so technical, it's so impenetrable, that, that the people like IFS and others who can bridge the gap between the clever technical world and the real world are more important than ever, I think.
Yeah. The academic economics is as you describe, but of course most economists are working in government or in the private sector or in research and are trying to, as you say, use and bridge that, and that's an incredibly important role.
So, Steve, I want to wrap up on my side by asking you maybe a couple of questions where you invite you to reflect across your career. And the first question is, what surprised yourself most about you? What surprising thing have you learned about yourself from your career?
I guess something I've observed, I don't know if it's a surprise or not, is I have a slight tendency to be a people pleaser. I want people to say, well done. I want them to be pleased with me. And there's years of therapy in that. And actually, being an MP is a terrible job for a people pleaser because your actual job depends upon it. Literally, those 80,000 people decide whether in 4 years' time you have a job or not. So you really do have to keep them happy. And so people would send you incredibly rude emails and you reply civilly and picking up on some of the interesting points they'd raised. And just through all the different things I've done, that's a terrible trait, really, is just wanting people to say, well done. And electoral politics always finds you out in the end. But
surely you had to learn to... Did that upset you when you started getting nasty letters and emails and so on? Or is that something you dealt with very easily?
No, the bit that hurts is when it's your own people. Haters going to hate. You know that there are opponents. But when early days of the coalition, you make a decision, you do something, and it's something you've had to do because of the political situation, but it's not something, frankly, you'd ever wanted to do. And people who are your own supporters saying, oh, sold out, have you? Oh, don't care anymore about poor people, do you? Or whatever. And people would write in who said, I voted for you last time, but I'm not going to vote for you again because of X. And you think, but if you actually knew me, if you knew what I'm trying to do and why I'm trying to do it, and what's going to happen when you don't vote for me, as indeed did happen, that's really hard. And I still remember I had letters from people after the 2015 election saying, if I thought you were going to lose, I'd have voted for you.
And Steve, my final question. So again, looking back across your career, is there a decision that you made that, looking back now with the wisdom you have, that perhaps you would like to revisit or wish you could revisit?
The decisions about where I worked, the roles I took on, have just been amazing. I have no regrets about any of those. I think there were policy decisions. The classic one would be the raising the women's state pension age and what they call the WASPy campaign, because there's a group of women who weren't properly informed about the change in their state pension age and found out about big changes at very short notice, feel very angry about it to this day and all of that. And if I had my time again, I would have done that better in all sorts of ways. So I think when people in future generations Google me, to the extent that I'm found at all, it will be to do with women's state pension age increases and so on. You can't do 5 years of ministerial office in a time of austerity and not have to do difficult stuff, as we discussed a minute ago. You're learning to be a minister, and particularly early on, I was learning the ropes and I made mistakes that I probably wouldn't make again, hopefully.
Well, Steve, thanks ever so much. That's been a fantastic, really insightful conversation, and hopefully will inspire budding economists to see at least some of the different sorts of things they could do with that set of skills and education. And really, what I think is great about what you've done, Steve, is you really have made a difference to the world as you set out to do. Both, I think you made a difference to the extent one can before you went into politics, clearly did in politics, and have continued to do afterwards, which I think is just a fantastic example, and something that has come across all the way through this conversation is how much you've enjoyed and appreciated and loved what you've done, which I think is a fantastic way to look back on a working life. So Sir Steve Webb, thank you ever so much.
Well, thank you both. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have, but at least it's been good fun for me anyway.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Hi. Thanks for joining us today. If the conversation got you thinking about your career or what might come next, then I offer one-to-one coaching. And you can find out more details on my website, michaelkellcoaching.com.
And if you enjoyed the discussion about the economics, do obviously look at the website of my old organisation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. But even more importantly, there are some excellent books recently written by me and others. Challenging Inequalities, which, as you can imagine, looks at the whole issue of inequality, and slightly older but still very much in date, Follow the Money. So do have a look at those if you thought anything that you heard about the economics of what we're going through was of any interest.
And we hope you can join us for the next episode of Econ to Icon.